Okay, hi. I'm so happy to be speaking with you today as part of the library podcast here at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Mohamed Elshahed. I'm a writer, curator, historian of architecture and material culture, usually focused on the Middle East, but also Global South in a comparative kind of study approach. My book is, the one book that's out in English is Cairo Since 1900, an architectural guide, which came out in 2020. And I'm currently here at the Institute working on a follow-up book that is focused on objects from modern and contemporary Egypt, to sort of tell micro-histories through those objects. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's such an honor, and I must say that this is the first time I'm speaking to an architect in a formal setting. So it's my pleasure completely, and would be happy to learn a lot from you in this conversation. And I'm Radhika Iyengar. I'm at the Center for Sustainable Development. I'm the Director of Education, and I work on Education for Sustainable Development. And here is my book with Cassie Zhu on climate change education. And we've been working on climate change education, education for sustainable development for quite some time at the center. And so happy to be here in Paris at the Ideas and Imagination Institute, working on different partnerships with UNESCO on education for sustainable development, and also glad to speak with you since I'm here. It's such an honor to be with you.
And what a lovely day on a spring, and sort of the spring vibes are out, so it's a good time to speak about the climate. You know, it's an architecture in this beautiful building, which has been restored to be part of the Institute. So maybe we can start with then the question of education and climate. Tell us about your thoughts on it, on the intersection of these two things.
I think over the past 10 years, I've been seeing that there is a lot of uptake on climate education, informal schools, informal settings. But somewhere we have lost this idea of using informal education, using non-formal education. I think that needs to be brought up to highlight, and so that we can all learn from each other and shouldn't just be relying on schools and shouldn't just be relying on our teachers who are already doing a lot. So getting a sense from NGOs who work on sustainability issues and having students take internships and do mentorships with with them, I think that should be highlighted more. And again, these conversations are amazing to have because I get to learn about architecture and sustainability of architecture from you, and you get to learn from the education side. So I think we need to have more conversations like this.
I'm a forever student, so I don't know. I'm not sure what I can educate. I'm one of those people, but I'm sure something I know I have something to say, but it's I also see myself as a kind of a forever student. And thinking of being a student, studying architecture in the U.S., New Jersey, there was almost no, and this is 20 years ago, there was almost no space in that education to talk about the environment. Environmental issues were non-existent practically. There was one course that all architecture students have to take, which is just a very technical course about essentially how to make the interior of buildings, the environment of the interior. So basically we're talking about heating and air conditioning. So it's not exactly environment as in the sense that we talk about, sustainability and so on. So basically architectural education, in my experience, as recent as someone who graduated in 2005, in a pretty, top architecture school in the East Coast of the U.S., didn't even acknowledge the environment. So is this are architecture students one of the? I mean, this is basically where we intersect. Your interest in the environment, my interest in architecture. So are architecture students and architecture schools a target for this kind of renewed interest in environmentalism?
Definitely. I think what we have seen so far, and at least at Columbia University, we just did a workshop which was titled "Anyone Can Teach About Climate," and where we had invited a couple of professors who were into literature, history. Some of them were into sciences. Some of very different fields coming together and sharing what they think about the environment and what are some of the steps that they need to take to integrate climate into their playwriting, climate into their literature, climate into their history classes, Spanish classes. So I think it is on the uptake, but again, I think it will take time, because these ideas and discussions are great, but how do you actually do it is another question. So there is there are centers at the university now who are trying to integrate this whole sustainability and environmental education into different courses. So there has been an uptake, and of course UNESCO is pushing a lot on cross-sectoral collaborations and interdisciplinary collaborations. Hopefully in the next 10 years you will not have an architecture student with your experience.
I hope so. Yes. Well, I mean, the issue of time seems to come up when we talk about expectations for turning things around when it comes to anything related to the environment. And it almost seems to me a bit counterintuitive, considering actually how fast it was to do the reverse. A lot of world societies up until the beginning of the 20th century, the majority, I would say, of cities and towns and villages all around the world, obviously, particularly in the global south, built in what maybe can be called traditional ways of building. And that was rapidly transformed into much more toxic approaches, anonymous architecture, less ownership of people being sort of having possession of their spaces. So it seems like that transformation happened very fast. But for some reason, a century later, when we talk about the integration of environmental consciousness or environmental education or transforming the lifestyles that we're now, realizing haven't really been great, not for us, not for the environment. For some reason, we give ourselves the space of time, even though we all know we're running out of time. So maybe just to take a second and talk about why is it that we're so patient when it comes to this?
Definitely, yes. I think sometimes we are too patient, and sometimes we take sometimes in education we say that changing a textbook is like moving a graveyard, because it's like takes a long time for the whole system to change, takes a long time to integrate one module, takes a lot of different processes and steps, and it just takes forever to make a small change in the entire system. But again, I think we need to have a multi-pronged strategy where we need to undo what we have, we need to unlearn what we learned from various different sources. We shouldn't just rely on one linear path that now we hope that these textbooks will change. We need to learn from people, we need to learn from our families, we need to learn from our history, as you're saying, that we have the transformation that we saw towards bad architecture and towards bad supplies of products that are coming from the West, especially living in India. We just forgot about bamboos, and we just forgot about all the sustainable architecture we could use for settings, and then suddenly we became more Western and, so to speak, more modern. And this is the problem that we are having right now, that we are tending towards modernity, which is taking us away from our environment and away from our roots. So how do we bring us back to ourselves into, and I know we discussed about the supply chain, and probably you can address those issues, that it's not easy to disrupt the existing supply chain that is there for architectural needs.
Absolutely. I mean, my thinking is it's a question of value, because as you say, with modernization, which happened rapidly in societies like India and Egypt and elsewhere, there was a high value put on a particular imagination of what it means to westernize or modernize, and then a lower value was assigned to the ways in which people built and did things already, in order to essentially create a reason for those ways to be erased. So if value then is not, if the value of these seemingly opposite things, this thing we call modernity, whatever it may be, which seems to be attached with notions of westernization and certain use of materials and lifestyles, if value is placed on that and removed from its opposite, and now we're sort of in a moment in which we're recognizing that perhaps this needs to be equal, an equilibrium needs to be established, or perhaps switched, actually. It seems to be a question of value. So that's a cultural thing. That's besides the material and the environmental. That's the cultural value that's associated with a way of life that then allows for a whole economy and politics, and therefore a supply chain for essentially the supply of the materials and products that then go into whatever is given high value. So how do we begin? I guess what I'm trying to say here is that education alone, without a reassessment of the political and economic system, including the supply chains and the shortages that are then created to then even increase the value. In hot places, air conditioners every year grow into shortage, which is just a ploy to make the prices more expensive. But those places, up until a century ago, like I said, had developed very sophisticated, very simple, but sophisticated at the same time ways to maintain a decent kind of temperature within an indoor space. And that's not possible anymore. So it's a question of value, which is a cultural thing, but it has direct impact on economy and politics.
That is so true. And I think we want to bring back those values that we have forgotten with the climate change really, making our lives more miserable every year. So I just want to give you one example of very close example of my sister running this non-profit organization, Mahashakti Seva Kendra in Bhopal. And they have 3 big rooms that the government has given. And on the 3 big rooms, they have these tin roof. And in summer, you can imagine, Mohammed, how difficult it is to be sitting in that tin roof room, and the tin just, absorbs all the heat. We are all boiling inside.
It's a pressure cooker.
It's a pressure cooker, and there is a fan that is working. The windows are open, and it is miserable. And every one of us, we get tired. All the ladies who are there working with my sister, they have like a tough time. Then we have to get a cooler, and then there is electricity shortages because this area is in a slum area. So all of the political system, as you are saying, I think the slum areas which have very little carbon footprint have more shortages than a very rich affluent area where all the policy makers are staying in that part of the town. So I think that dynamics also we need to keep into account. But at the same time, they realize that there's something wrong with this tin roof, and they, that there could be other alternatives. And my sister worked with another architect who brought in bamboo roofs and attached to, these big saris, and it's like a really marvelous architecture that they have made, and they are so much better now because the roof doesn't heat up so fast.
Of course.
And what did it require? It didn't really require like really things coming from the Western world or like amazing technological innovation or expensive materials. Bamboo is there, and they were able to use that. But again, going back to the original culture and going back to reassessing what those values are, because you're absolutely correct in saying that we need to see where our value system is, and either our value system is making the rich and the poor divide go wider, and the climate impacts go wider, where the poor and economically marginalized communities get most of the climate related impacts, which is so unfair. Or we have a value system where we have everyone together looking at our own ways of living, looking at seeing what are sustainable sources that are not expensive at all, to use them for our education setting, and not just the roof but also educate people around it. Because there's one thing that architects would do to have like a very wonderful roof and very sustainable roof, but also talk about it, what is the difference between a tin roof and a bamboo roof, and integrate that into the education and integrate that into the curriculum. I think that's something we need to be involving as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a few things that you said that I want to sort of pick at. One is that yes, the good solutions tend to be cheap, local, and effective, but this is part of what I was trying to say earlier, is that in that kind of formula, very few people and middlemen have opportunities to step in and make a buck. So there's a conflict here between a certain kind of economy that's constantly looking to create these in-between spaces in sort of the supply of materials and the making of things, the experts that now gets, jobs are invented all the time that are actually kind of useless jobs, and we kind of all look at each other like, yeah, that's a kind of a useless job, but hey, it pays, but it makes the process of doing things more complicated. It makes it necessitate other people coming and experts, and so there just seems to be a whole. So that's one point. It's kind of how the easy solution. So therefore, the inability to restore, we can say, an ecosystem in which people can source their materials locally, the inability to restore that has very clear reasons, which are, again, economic and political. I'm going to probably keep going back to that point. It's kind of my fixation. I'm convinced that aesthetic solutions, education without hands-on, all of these things, without any acknowledgement or engagement in a serious way, critical way, with the political and economic structures, is kind of also aesthetic in many ways. You know, a lot of, even in the most advanced skyscrapers built today, you know, a lot of them will claim with a sticker on the front door that they're environmentally friendly, despite the fact that they're probably in practice really not. It's just who defines what's an environmentally friendly building in order to get these expensive certifications that just put a sticker on the door. So that's one thing. The other point that you mentioned is education of the people who would live under the new, which is actually the old way of doing the roof. Because I feel like the architecture has always, and until now, some communities in parts of Africa, I'm sure parts of India and other places, the relationship with architecture is hands-on, in the sense of it's expected that every season the roof will be changed, and the community comes together and it's an event, you know, it's a communal event, it's a coming together event, it's so people connect with each other, they work together, they use their hands, and it's kind of a ritualistic relationship between people and building. I feel like when that is restored, again, there would be less need, perhaps the education interventions are essentially looking to restore that relationship. So that's the other thing that I wanted to pick up from what you said. And then the third point is about this class divide. And you had mentioned earlier that you're doing work with the UN, which I would argue, you know, I'm a historian looking at the Middle East, and the UN played a role with hiring experts, urban planning experts, to modernize cities and to plan cities from scratch, even in places like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And those had to follow what were called then modern conventions: wide roads, car focused, concrete, probably, as it was becoming the cheaper, more practical material, and so on. So the same institutions that we're using today as vehicles to educate, they themselves had a role in a way in creating the problem, with very little hindsight, because, you know, the difference between that moment after World War II, with this kind of expert-led UN role in modernizing and developing, you know, that's not too long ago. That's when my parents were born. You know, we're not talking about ancient history. So those same institutions are today doing, it seems, some sort of effort, at least in representation of themselves, as trying to fix the problem. But I would say not as forcefully as their participation earlier in creating the problem. And there's always a kind of what I would call kind of bourgeois solidarity. You have UN officials who probably do have pretty bourgeois lifestyles. That's how you get to that kind of space. And other institutions, I'm not picking on the UN, and they come to countries like India or Egypt. They have studies, lots of charts, lots of papers. But in the end, the suggestions are, again, like you said, towards the poor, who already occupy a very small carbon footprint. Meanwhile, the bourgeois counterparts of those experts and UN people and so on in those countries, they're left alone to continue on building those kind of earlier modernizing vision with malls, car-centric, individual houses in the desert with pitched roof is the kind of thing that you see in Egypt. Nobody's talking about those. And Egypt built a new capital in a very short time, in the last few years. And currently, the government is mandating electricity shortages, or cuts, aimed at basically all the poor areas. Meanwhile, this brand new city in the middle of the desert, still with no population, fully lit all the time, because the image is more important. So there just seems to be a kind of a discrepancy here between who are we educating, what are the right vehicles to enact change, and when do we actually institutionally break this kind of bourgeois solidarity where rich people around the world just get to, tap each other on the shoulder for doing these nice things for poor people, but actually they're putting more pressure on people who already are underserved. So what do you
do? One point I think you mentioned about this community living and education as a part of I think that's where the gap is, and that's why we want to bring in back this focus on informal and non-formal education system. So just giving you one example, that Columbia University, we worked on a curriculum for one of the southern states in India on education for sustainable development, and it required, the roof had solar panels and everything, and the government came and inaugurated the center. The girls were supposed to come and learn about computers, computer literacy, and also do education for sustainable development. But somehow this whole solar panel was very notional. Like, we didn't really integrate it into how much electricity we are giving back, how much electricity we are saving into the curriculum, and it was just there. Everyone came and said, wow, it looked very fancy, but the fancy part is actually how much electricity we are saving and how much electricity we are giving back to the government, and neither of those numbers were actually integrated into our curriculum, nor was it given back to the government to say that you can have more of these structures, more of solar panels, but try to understand why we are doing it. So I think the reasoning of architectural interventions in education has been so weak that we have not been able to really integrate the architectural change that we've been wanting to bring back into the education system. So having it a community affair, having it much more about using the infrastructure to talk about things in the community, I think that's something we need to bring back. That's still a gap. And in terms of institutions, yes, I feel that, my journey of environmental education started with 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa with a project that we are doing, and in India, of course, where I come from. But during COVID, when I was locked to my location, which is in New Jersey, I realized that in the US, we needed much more environmental education than any other countries that I have been participating, because there I have been working on, with all these with the education units. I've been saying carbon footprint, but their carbon footprint is so low as compared to the use and throw culture that we saw in the US, that I felt that we needed to start with environmental education in the Western world and in the US specifically, because there, it's even in school systems. I'm not even talking about the big petroleum industries and the big plastic industries. I'm just talking about in school systems. We had, this use and throw culture going on. Plastic bottles were rampant. No one cared. Half bottles, birthday parties in such a lavish way, where we had all these fancy theme parties, and again garbage after garbage. No one did
on top
composting.
Of that, buildings, in summer over air conditioned, freezing inside. People wear jackets in their offices, and then in winter overheated inside, because somehow, as if the fossil fuels that are somewhere down the line are necessary to create both the heating and the cooling, as if they're just available forever. There's a kind of excessive consumption with zero awareness,
with no mindset at all that there are maybe other parts of the world which have all these power shortages, and they are unable to even cook food because there is no power, and there is they are unable to work. And here we are living in this lap of luxury as if resources are unlimited. You can use, there's no, as long as personal happiness is what counts. So I think going back to seeing where you are located and what is the role that your country is playing, and be critical about it, is something that we need to really start working on. I'm not saying that we can there is very lot of sustainability in India. There are also many challenges there. But given that I'm in the US, given that we have one of the highest per capita consumption of energy, and a lot of it is wasted, I think we need to start reflecting on making climate education not just that's a part that we do, but it's, as you said, lifelong learner. You are a lifelong learner. I think we all need to be lifelong learners to have a dent in this whole climate literacy framework.
Absolutely. I remember some years ago, I think maybe it was around the pandemic, there was something circulating online about the population of the world, and all the discussion, usually in the West, about the human population getting too big, supposedly, looks to, again, target the poor in terms of cutting down birth rates, so that a mother in sub-Saharan Africa should somehow not have 4 children, even though we know statistically, and the information is available, if we just talk about it a little bit more, that a mother having a child in New Jersey, that already that child will, through their lifetime, consume perhaps hundreds times more planetary resources than a mother in Kampala. Yet all of the sort of the agency and NGO work to pretend, I would say, and I'm very confident in using the word pretend in most cases, to engage with the issue. They go to the mother in Kampala or in Egypt and they say, hey, one child is enough or two children are enough, you know. So it's kind of deeply integrated in issues beyond even patterns of consumption. The way it comes down to ideas of population control, which unfortunately in a quite a racist world that we live in, target the people who are least benefiting, who are least consuming, and telling them to have less children and not reproduce as much with the excuse of environmentalism. Meanwhile, New Jersey and California AC is on, 3-car garage, 5 Coca-Cola bottles a day per person. What are we talking about in a way here?
I think this is modern colonialism, in which where we are trying to have all these ideas for the poor and for someone else. We are not included. Like in the US, US is a part of the Sustainable Development Goals framework, and they agreed to that they will meet the Sustainable Development Goals, but neither have they once given the voluntary national reviews that are required for every country who has taken on this task. And why is the US committing to something and not really working on it? And so I feel that it is such a fake world that yes, it's SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, for the poor countries, not for people who are actually having the highest impact on carbon emissions. And that's again, all these ideas that are there can be used for other countries, and we are fine because we have the money, and it's all individual driven and it's very capitalistic, and you can decide if you have the resources to do it. I think there needs to be some control over it. Shouldn't be all on individuals. Why is this plastic a problem? It should be coming from the plastic mafia, that we need to actually do something about it. But of course there are all these big deals that happen, and by the time it comes down to the consumers in the US, it's so cheap. You can buy so many plates, you can buy so many cups in like just a few cents, and there you go. Why will all the burden be taken up by the US consumers is also another thing that we need.
It's a general trend to create structural sort of systems, I suppose, that have structural sort of stability in a way, that then cause these kinds of issues, but then to direct, like you said, the blame or the responsibility on the consumer. So somehow this entire infrastructure that would be necessary to produce this plastic bottle on the shelf, and then gets a little sticker where the poor consumer, poor or not, looking at the bottle, has to decide for themselves, should I really buy this bottle? I'm gonna, but then what other choice, so it's kind of like a forced dilemma in a way. So I agree. I don't think these are, I would say kind of the pinnacle of the failure of individualism as a culture is to realize that the individual can't actually do that much when it comes to these big issues, which most of the issues that we have to deal with as human beings are pretty big issues that need to be solved communally. And so in a situation where the rich and poor are not operating communally, then those solutions are not going to come from anywhere. And I don't think education or some performative policies here and there will solve it. So really we are talking about the need for, I would say, quick radical change that involves education, yes, restoration of lifestyles and ways of doing things that were deemed whatever word you would like to use. Traditional is kind of the soft one, but backwards is the kind of word that would have been used very casually before, not too long ago, and so on. But now they're proven to be the progressive ideas, the ones that say everybody who has money is trying to build an off-grid house with a bunker that will basically run its own electricity and its own whatever, assuming sort of the apocalypse is coming because of how these issues have taken on such a drastic, visible impact in our lives. So somehow this idea of restoring those notions of how to build and sort of live more sustainably are now being adopted by the very rich to protect themselves in remote places. So I find this to be some sort of, divine comedy in a way. I don't know.
That is so true. But, I believe in education, and I feel that I stick to my claim that we need to rampantly change education, or having this transformative education into all schools in the Western world, so that people really become aware. And students these days are very wise. I think they are wiser than adults, because they get a lot of knowledge from all the different sources. They go on the internet, they ask their teachers questions. We have seen Greta as a great example. I think I really have hopes in the young generation that they will really help us to make ourselves more conscious, and maybe sometimes also humiliate the adults that we are not on the right track. And I think that's where I see the Western, at least in the US, that's where I see a lot of movement, where youngsters are asking questions, and they are bringing the consciousness back towards making us more sustainable, and making us more, having this earth more livable in the US.
The younger ones are the ones who have to deal with the consequences, so it makes sense that I would hope more of them would be directly engaged. So can we talk a bit more about architecture?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so I was wondering, what are your thoughts about this? Because as a historian of architecture, I found myself grappling with a landscape in which demolition and destruction, as you can observe as a non-architect just by watching the news of the Middle East, there's quite a lot of destruction. But usually the question that first comes to mind to those who care, who are very few, is the cultural loss. Just in Gaza in the past few months, one of the oldest churches in the world was just simply bombed. So usually people talk about the cultural loss. But I think to separate culture and kind of what we talked about, meaning and values before, from the materiality of things is a big mistake, because buildings hold the energy that was necessary to build them, in the sense of, if you needed to get a truck to ship material across 3 states to come and build your house, that energy that was burned and consumed just to deliver the material is somehow actually now embedded in the walls of the structure. So some people call it gray energy, as I understand it. So when that building gets demolished, it's not only that you're demolishing the structure with its cultural value, whatever it may be, but you're also erasing all of the energy that may have manifested in other ways, such as trucking, moving things around, and all of that, and human labor, of course. It all also evaporates in that moment. And then on top of it, the rubble from a demolition needs to go into a landfill. And I learned recently that, in some places up to 1/3 of landfills in the world are occupied with architectural debris. Things that are being demolished for no good reason, just to build a highway, or just because it's seen politically as no longer useful or interesting or beautiful, or whatever people in power decide. But the idea is, my concern with demolition started with the cultural side of it. But more and more I realized there's a very heavy environmental impact for the loss of these buildings. If they were already working fine, they just needed some tender love and care to be continued to be used, as opposed to demolishing, erasing all of that gray energy besides the cultural and historical meanings, and then probably build a more toxic building in its place that we then call modern and sell for more money, which is just, so again it kind of goes back to a whole infrastructure of how our built environment is created. So with something like this, would that kind of awareness come into that kind of idea? Because usually when we think about environmental education, we only talk about things like solar panels and all of that, but actually I think to link the environmental issues and the heritage and value and memory issue together, I think this is a way to make people care a bit more, and it's hopefully a way to restoring those older ways of doing things. In Egypt, just one last thing, up until very recently, if a house needs serious change because the structure is unstable, people would keep whatever still works, a door, an archway. They would, and historically people would sort of add and correct in piecemeal fashion. So this is why we end up with architecture, that when a Western Orientalist 100 years ago would come to a place like Egypt, would say, what is this building? I don't understand it. It's because it's been built over hundreds of years with people constantly making small changes, so it doesn't just look like a nice Renaissance building that was designed with one man's idea. Very difficult to understand. And those buildings that were difficult to read were given lower value, and again, demolished and destroyed. So the way of constantly incorporating what survives into something new has just kind of vanished as a way of building. So I would say that that's something, again, to bring into the awareness of students in their education, so that it's not just the solar panels and the different technological things that can be added.
No, sir, actually this is such an interesting explanation, Mohamed, because in climate education we have this concept called the systems thinking approach, where we say that everything is interconnected, and in our curriculums and lesson plans we need to not just focus on silos where social study and geography and history and mathematics and science is done in separate buckets, but we all have to use all of these different subjects to talk about climate, and that's how climate can be integrated into the curriculum. So this is such a perfect example to use in a systems thinking approach, where we are talking about repair, we are talking about maintenance, where we are talking about economy, where we are talking of landfills, education, culture, so many different things that we can be integrated into this perfect into this example. And you have given me a very brilliant idea to focus on a lesson plan which talks about preserving your cultural heritage, as well as using this arches and doorways to maintain what we have as a part of history, but also reducing the waste that goes away, and also the whole cycle of supplies and the gray energy that you mentioned. I think those are really important aspects, but again, it has not been done because we like doing things really in a simple way, where we have fill in the blanks, match the columns, we do science, we do social studies, we do geography. But if everything connects with each other, then who is that teacher who's going to teach? Because that teacher doesn't have a breadth of knowledge. And so that's where we are stuck with climate education, that how do we have all these examples that are that built upon each other as different subjects, and how do we actually create a continuum? Because children, when they have the lived experiences, are seeing all these things in reality. They are seeing what's happening, they are seeing how the houses are changing, they are seeing what is being thrown, they are sad that some part is being thrown and some part is not. But we are, as educators, we are unable to bring in these lived examples in the classrooms.
Absolutely.
So I'm hoping that your example can be one of the examples that we can try to learn from, and our viewers of this video can help us to also think about how in their context they can use. Also, it's so contextual. Some of these things can be framed in a very generic way, where they have all these interdisciplinary approaches, but also, as you brought in examples of Egypt, there are examples of my city in Bhopal, where a big palace of my ancestors was brought down because it was difficult for the corporation to keep it up. So I think those are aspects that we need to really link back, and again bringing values, bringing systems, bringing ethics, bringing history as a part of where we want to go. I think those are all very important part of how climate education needs to be taught.
Actually, you just made me think of something. Do you think the hyper-specialization of professions that we as a society were kind of forced into, I mean, actually, I would say my own professional and personal crisis to operate in this system is that I refuse to fit in somebody else's category of what I'm supposed to do, and somehow that's enough to, well, good luck to you, So there's a kind of a hyper-specialization that if you do want to be the multitasker who has a breadth of experience because you see it connected in another way, you don't just want to be the architect that does things this way, or the curator that does this, I want to do, there's no place for you. So then you become sort of on the margins, and that's because of a hyper-specialized culture, which, based on what you're saying, is a problem, because the economist that's doing the accounting is not talking to the woman who's doing the educating, is not talking to the woman who's doing the policy writing, is not, and there's all these gaps because we have so many Yeah, so like, what do you think
It
about
is a
this?
very complex issue. So one, if you have to have this breadth of things, there is no one degree that fits into, what is a specialization you are going to get, that fits into all these different categories. And when you are becoming much more, I guess, ingrained into one thing, then you have a depth of knowledge in that area. And only because of your interest you can also try to see what the other areas are. So that's what the challenge is right now. At Columbia University, we actually have this we have a big climate school, and there's a sustainability track, and they take a breadth of courses. They have economics, they have earth sciences, and they have public health courses. So I think that's where we need to.
I would include architecture.
Yes.
Since we all have to live somewhere and work somewhere that's built, it would be useful that the environmental focused in their studies and sort of environmental issues, that comes into. I think that would be very useful actually to add in there.
Yeah. You can be rest assured, Mohammed, that I'm going to use architecture examples after this conversation. So I will definitely be in touch with you to see how I've integrated examples of architecture in our courses and in our outreach programs. We run an eco-ambassador program for students across the globe, and people from Istanbul, students from Istanbul join, and people from various different parts of India join on an online program. And I think that's a very good space where we can, since architecture is a topic that is such a livable topic and can also be is a common topic that spans across all
Absolutely. We all have to live in buildings, so it should be part of the conversation. I don't know, any closing words, any thoughts?
I think this has completely been very fascinating to talk to you, Mohammed, and I feel that I've learned a lot, and I'm hoping that I will be less patient with education and be a little bit more aggressive with how we want to bring in transformative education, because you're right, time is closing in very soon, and it is a big task that we have in hand. And I'm hoping to learn from more conversations like this with you and with others to build those bridges that we have lost, and hoping that we can make a dent in education, climate education, through all the examples that you are giving.
I'll be happy to participate if you call me.
Definitely, yes.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me as well. I come to environmental issues kind of more as a passionate human being who's looking around and noticing what's happening, as opposed to for a career reason and I find that other people that I've met, a lot of people do have the passion before they put themselves in a track that sort of makes it part of their life. But I feel like a lot of the people that I met with passion on the issues, because they watch it, the effects every day, are not schooled or professionally prepared to talk about environmental issues at all. And I think at the end of the day, as far as I see it, it has to do with one's relationship really with the earth. I think the perception that some people, I would say more people as time progresses in the last couple of centuries, see themselves as objects standing on an earth, is a problem when you compare it to other social formations that actually see themselves as an extension of the earth. So if you kind of operate in that mindset, so maybe that's somewhere to start with education. Let's start with kindergarten and remind children that they didn't just land on this earth. They're part of it. They are a symptom of it, what it does. And our earth produces people, and people need to take care of it. And that's something maybe that we can start with at a young age. So thank you so much for today's conversation.
Thank you.
And I hope we collaborate in the future.
Yeah, definitely, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.